believe it was almost 2 years ago. Is it not on? Okay. I believe it was almost 2 years ago that because of COVID, like many churches, we had to rethink the way we were going to do things. Of course, everyone had different opinions on the right way to do those things. Probably just about as many opinions as there were noses. And in our congregation, 2 of us serve as elders. And so, of course, we want to take into consideration what other people's concerns and that sort of thing. Initially, I think it hit all of us pretty quick. What? We're quarantining? What? What does that even mean? What does that look like? And after we got figured out what we were going to do, I mentioned, I think, this to a couple of you, we began meeting out in a rural location, one of the members outside. The weather was March, so it was, it could be a little cool, but it could be warm. You know how March is. It can be a beautiful day, it can be an ugly day. And thankfully, the first Sunday we were there, it was beautiful. And I presented some thoughts at that time about the fact, well, this is different. And outdoors, away from the eyes of the world, taking the Lord's Supper in a very non-traditional way, it was all different. And I observed then that very often we don't like different. Like the word new, there is a discomfort that can come with new and different. And likewise, we talked about the fact that different is not inherently good or bad. It's just different. There are good reasons to be different, and there are bad reasons to be different. And some will say that being different just for the sake of being different isn't good. I differ. That expression is not quite accurate. Sometimes different is good to be, just to be different, if for no other reason than to show that different is okay. Because when you never do anything different, we raise up children and grandchildren who don't know that there are different ways to do this. And we can probably all imagine now, being adults, looking back on our childhood, if we were raised in churches, we are expecting it to be one way, and somewhere in our teen years, maybe it waited till our college years, we wondered whether we could do it any differently. We maybe go to another congregation, and they didn't do it the same way, and we're going, is this a sound congregation? You know, because they did something different. Not true. We don't want to be different than the Word of God, but we can be different than our traditions. And sometimes we have trouble telling the difference between those, and that's a bad thing, and that's why sometimes it's good to be different just to be different. But there are many carnal reasons to be different as well. So I'm not suggesting that all calls to do something different are noble or teaching opportunities. Different is an adjective. Oh, one thing I wanted to point out. I put this map up here for the first slide. Okay, we're going to take an advertising break here for just a second. If you want to come visit me, there you have on the map, there's Grinnell over here, and there's Pontiac over there. 4 hours and 3 minutes is what it says. So that's how long it'll take me to get home tonight, thereabouts. And so if you want to know how to come visit me, that's how to come visit me. You're basically taking 80 over to Interstate 39, which is a north-south road, and then you take some little county highway for about a half hour over to Pontiac. Most of you, when you're traveling south, you probably go down 74 through Peoria. And then you're going south, end up going south of Pontiac. So we're really not on your way anywhere. Even if you're going east, you'll just stay on 80 and go right north of us. We're not on your way anywhere. So you'd have to intentionally want to come and see me and my wife. So, and if you do, there's our house. There's my address. Oh, and I had my email address on the previous one. That's how I communicate. I'm old-fashioned. I communicate by email. You can text me, but I'll probably miss it. If you send me an email, I check my email all the time. And so that's how you can get hold of me. And then just, of course, I feel naked without my family. But there they are. There's my wife in the pink there right next to me. And that was taken almost a year ago. So there's an additional grandchild now there and another one on the way. So we're up to 13 grandchildren. There's only 12 in that picture. 5 kids, and 4 of the 5 are married. The young lady in the green in the back is single. So if you know anybody that would be interested in her, she might be interested in him. So, and, oh no, this is being recorded. So hopefully she never sees this one. That would be different. All right. So let's get on with our lesson then as we talk about different. Different is an adjective, and thus it is a word that is used to describe something. It simply means not the same as another or each other, unlike in nature, form, or quality. Synonyms for different would include distinct or separate. And so while there are contexts in which we would not want to be different, there are contexts in which we would want to be different or separate or set apart from others. Now, some people just revel in marching to the beat of a different drummer. They just love to be different for difference sake only. Maybe it's to get attention. Maybe it's just to push the envelope and to razz other people, to make other people uncomfortable. Like I said, there's all kinds of bad reasons to be different. But there are good reasons to be different. So if the left is in power, then to be different, people will swing to the right. And if the right is in power, then to be different, people will swing to the left. And we see that going on in our country. And in a world without standards, this pendulum swing is inevitable. But in this lesson, I want to explore a different. Ways in which different is not only good, but it is inherent to being God's people. We are called as Christians to be different, but in a different way than the world likes to be different. And if we're not, then we're not living up to our calling. Consider an Old Testament example of what I want us to consider in this lesson. Recall that when Israel had just left their bondage in Egypt, led out by Moses, and they finally approached the promised land. They sent in 12 men to spy out the land. You probably know that story pretty well. And we know the disappointing report that those 12 men brought back, that 10 of those spies brought back. They said, we can't take the land. They're too big. They're too strong. It was a view that was different than the leadership. It was a view that was different than Moses. Moses said, we can take the land. And they come back with a different idea. God had told them, I'll give you the land. They came back with a different idea. Different wasn't good in that case, was it? It wasn't good in that case. It was contrary to God's will. God was displeased with that faithless report and ultimately would not allow that generation to enter into the promised land. But you also know that there were exceptions to that punishment. Note what is said about one of those in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 24. Numbers chapter 14 and verse 24. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. So here we learn about Caleb, and we're told explicitly that he had a different spirit than most in his generation. And as a result of him having that different spirit, he was treated differently by God than the rest. So when the majority of people are behaving unfaithfully, it's not only good to be different, it is essential if we want to obtain an outcome that is different than the judgment that was going to come by God upon the unfaithful. So I want us to talk about being different for a purpose. So go with me to the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, and beginning with verse 14. We've been to the Sermon on the Mount a couple of times throughout this series. But you'll recognize this. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So as usual, Jesus is using illustrations that we can relate to. The imagery of light and darkness is a powerful one because the difference is so stark between light and dark. Light would be absolutely no value to finding one's way through the darkness if it was not different from the darkness. And so in calling his disciples to be lights in this world, to call us, each of us who've named Jesus Christ as our Lord, calling us to be different in this world of darkness, Jesus is calling us to be significantly and valuably different. Not just different, but different in a way that is significant and valuable. Jesus says they will see your good works. Lights shine to reveal. That's what they do, to reveal what is good versus what is bad. And that's a vital difference, isn't it not? What's good and what's bad? And he says they'll see those good works and they will glorify you? No, that's not what Jesus says. They will glorify your Father in heaven. So being different in a godly way is not about drawing attention to ourselves, which is one reason that people are different. Want attention. Hey, everybody, look at me. I'm different. Okay? And that's not what it's about. Being different is about getting people to glorify God. That's the ultimate end. To glorify God for what is good because He is the light source. He is the definer, like we talked about yesterday. He is the creator. He is the sustainer of everything that is good. And we want people to see that in the midst of all of this darkness. Go with me to Philippians chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14. He says, "Do all things without murmuring and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain." Lots of people, if you haven't noticed over the last 2 years, lots of people murmur and complain about a lot of different things. Sometimes we're murmuring and complaining because things are different. And so over the last 2 years, we've all probably done that about COVID, about quarantines, about masks, about restrictions on freedoms, about China, about politics, about justice, about racial unrest, about politicians, about voting, about fraud, about rallies, about riots. Differing is something that we all easily fall into. But we're called to be different in our differing. We're supposed to be lights in the world, a significantly different kind of different. Not different in carnal ways, but in blameless ways, he says here. Innocent ways, as children of God ways. Shining as lights in the world, as described here, is not accomplished by wearing masks or by not wearing masks. It is not accomplished by getting the vaccine or refusing the vaccine. It is not accomplished by voting for Biden or voting for Trump. Different is done by holding fast to the word of life. 50% of the nation votes for one guy and 50% votes for the other guy, roughly. I mean, if you really want to be different for difference sake, vote for the Green Party or something like that. That would be different. I'm not advocating that, by the way. I didn't vote for anybody in the Green Party, never have, probably never will. But the point is, if you just want to be different, that would be different. Otherwise, you're just voting for somebody that everybody else votes for. 1 Peter chapter 2. Oops, I'm sorry there. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. You notice those descriptions there in verse 9? I read through them kind of fast there. Did you notice that? You've probably read that verse many times before, pretty familiar with it. Those descriptions emphasize different. Every one of them emphasize different. Chosen generation. Okay? Royal priesthood. Holy nation. God's own special people. All speak to a relationship with God that is distinct and separate from the rest of the world. And these terms are used for the nation of Israel. You might have recognized that when God called them out of Egypt in Exodus chapter 19. These are the terms that are used of them then. But they broke the covenant, like we talked about last night, and rejected Jesus Christ, and they are no longer these. Unless they repent and come to God through Jesus Christ. And then and only then can they be these things. And this is a perspective that we're to have of ourselves that is easy, very easy for us to lose in the midst of worldly strife and conflict. You know, all that's going on in the world, all that's on the headline news. It's easy for us to lose this perspective. For example, as political parties vie for power, we feel sort of like it's almost our duty, compelled to choose sides and have opinions about which candidate might be best. But Christ calls us to align ourselves with him. And being chosen to be a part of a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and God's own special people is not mere status, Sometimes that's what I think it fell into for the children of Israel. That was their status. We're God's chosen people. And we should not fall into that as mere status as well. It's not the goal. It is for a purpose and a function. Did you see it there? He says all these things. This is what you are. This is what you are. We're not supposed to come away for that and pat ourselves on the back. He says you are all of these things right there in the middle of verse 9, that you may. Here's purpose. That's a purpose statement. That you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You see, he goes on to say, we were once not God's people, but now it's different. And aren't we glad that it's different? We've now obtained mercy. And because of that, it obligates us to be different, to be holy, to be lights in a dark world. I don't know if you've noticed, surely you have, that lights tend to stand out in a dark room, right? That's why we turn them on, so that we're able to see. But a lot of people don't like light to stand out, like teenagers on school mornings in the middle of winter. It's dark, they're comfortably asleep, and it's time to get up, so you flip the light on and say, let's go, it's time to get up. Oh! Hiding from that, I don't want to get up, turn that light off. I know, because I had the same reaction. There are times where we don't like the light in the midst of darkness. And so we shouldn't be shocked that the world reacts similarly when our lights shine. Don't take it personally. They don't like it when anybody's light shines. They like the darkness. But we've been called to be lights. And that sometimes means we're going to end up being irritants to people. Not because that's our goal. And if it is our goal, which is why some people are different, remember we talked about that at the beginning, sometimes teenagers just choose the opposing team. I think like you guys did. I think I heard at the funeral yesterday. Their dad was a Bears fan, so what are we going to be? Packers fans. Going to be different to irritate dad. Okay? And that's pretty harmless. But sometimes teenagers do things differently than mom and dad want because they want to show their independence, their ability to make their own decisions, and really usually end up demonstrating that they aren't as independent as they think they are, and they aren't mature enough to make their own decisions yet. But they learn from that, hopefully, with the guidance of parents. But the point is, that's not the kind of different that we're trying to be. We're not just trying to be irritating. We're not just trying to tell the world that we are better than them, because isn't that what the world says? Oh, you guys just think you're better than we are. Well, if that is our motive, if that's what we're doing, then we're wrong. That should not be what we're doing. We're not trying to put ourselves up on a pedestal and to lower everybody else. There are people who do that, but that shouldn't be what we're doing. We're proclaiming the praises of God. We're trying to lead people out of darkness to Jesus Christ. And will most people be irritated by that? Yes, they will. Will most people reject it? Yes, they will. It is going to be the extreme minority who are going to say, thank you for turning that light on. I needed that. And that's who we're after. That's what we're looking for. That's what God is looking for. God is looking for people who want what he has. And so, let's talk about being different in faithfulness and in conduct. And I've gotten behind on my screen a couple of times here, and I apologize for that. I don't know if I'm just not pushing the button hard enough or what. All right. So, 1 Peter chapter 2, again. This time, verses 11 and 12. which I believe we read last night. Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. So it is on the basis outlined in verses 9 and 10 that he makes this appeal. This text that we just read emphasizes that this world is not our home, and we've been talking about that the whole meeting. We are sojourners and pilgrims. Some translations may say strangers, aliens, or exiles in a foreign land. And that this perspective is the theme of this letter seems obvious when we also consider how it begins and how it ends. Chapter 1, verse 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. It's addressed to pilgrims, or your translation might say exiles. And it concludes with chapter 5 and verse 13. She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son. Peter figuratively refers to she who is in Babylon. Who is she? And who is in Babylon? I mean, Babylon really was not an inhabited city at this time. So what does he mean? Well, Babylon came to stand for, figuratively, the nations of the world. Kind of like Egypt did before Babylon, before the Israelites were taken into Babylonian captivity. So I believe this is a reference to the church being in exile in this world. Babylon probably stands for Rome. It's possible it stands for Jerusalem here. We don't know for sure. But it stands for a power that is of this world and is against God's chosen people. And all of this is very reminiscent of who we talked about a little earlier in the meeting, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And you don't recall those last three, but that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, same guys. It was, as we talked about before, the design of King Nebuchadnezzar to take the best Judean captives and enculturate them in the ways of Babylon. But remember, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies. That's in Daniel chapter 1. This is representative of the fact that these men were not going to forsake their devotion to God or their identity as God's chosen people in order to enjoy the benefits and the perks of the worldly culture in which they were exiles. And that is why we are called upon, in 1 Peter here, to abstain from fleshly lusts and to make sure that our conduct is honorable among the Gentiles, among the people we live. As followers of Christ, we are aliens in a foreign land, and indeed, the physical culture, the physical nation, the physical race, the physical family is not supposed to define us ultimately. Rather, we are different because we are defined by Jesus Christ. And that makes us significantly different and valuably different. And that will inevitably put us at odds with the culture in which we are strangers. We will be different in a different way, in a Christ-like way. Go with me to 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. John writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. but he who does the will of God abides forever. We know this text, we're familiar with this text, but do we apply this text to our present sojourn in this world like we should? Because you could insert the word Babylon here in place of the word world and understand the approach of Daniel and his friends. Let's do that. Do not love Babylon or the things in Babylon. If anyone loves Babylon, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in Babylon, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of Babylon. And Babylon is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. Of course, to make it applicable to ourselves, then guess what we got to do? We got to read that and see if it makes sense if we insert the word America there. Do not love America or the things in America. If anyone loves America, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in America, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of America. And America is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. And if we don't like that specific application, then it probably means we love America the more than we should. Go to James chapter 4. In James chapter 4, beginning with verse 1, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. I've made this observation several times in this series. We've seen a lot of conflict and fighting amongst ourselves this past year. Amongst ourselves as Americans, amongst ourselves in our various communities, amongst ourselves in local congregations. Where does that come from, according to James? The world fights and wrangles over their differences. But we're called to a different. We're not supposed to fight like the world fights. Selfish ambition and fighting and wars come from worldly thinking. Note chapter 3, verse 16 of James there. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing will be there. That's the problem. That's at the root of so much of this. All of this, we're told, wars against our souls. And indeed, these conflicts take more out of us than I think we realize at the time that it's happening. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but sometimes it's not obvious and will only show up later, maybe physically, but also often spiritually. And so this wars against our soul and inevitably leads to conflict, including conflict with those who take a stand with Jesus as King. Here, James writes that friendship with the world is enmity with God. Certainly, Christians are at odds with so much of what the world embraces. Therefore, our loyalty is not to a fleshly country, but to Christ and his kingdom. Again, we could just insert the land of our nativity into this text and make appropriate application to ourselves. Brethren, we are not Americans who happen to be Christians. We are Christians who happen to sojourn in America. And if we don't make that distinction, then we won't make a difference in this world. And if we're going to make a difference in this world, then we cannot just be different, because there's a lot of people just be different. We're going to have to be a different. We have to make sure that our conduct is honorable, so that even though they may speak against us as evil, they may by our good works, which they observe, glorify God. And Peter isn't trying to say that everyone who sees your good works will therefore glorify God. In fact, quite the contrary. I don't think most people who see your good works will glorify God. But some will. And again, those are who we're looking for. And you think about it, this is very much like what happened to the Babylonian exiles, who remained faithful to God, who didn't conform to Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were threatened with death if they did not bow down to the king's image. You know the story. But they would not bow down to the king's image. You recall their response was something to the effect of, our God will save us, but even if he doesn't save us, we're still not bowing. And their faith was literally tested by fire. And the impact of that, do you remember? Nebuchadnezzar glorified God. Maybe that's what Jesus and his apostles and prophets were meaning when they say they'll observe your good works and glorify God. Just like Nebuchadnezzar did. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's an exception. Again, most people aren't going to do that, but it's notable that he did. Of course, the greatest example of being different for God is found in Jesus' behavior during his arrest and his trial and his crucifixion. Right? From his gracious healing of one who had come to arrest him. Remember, someone had taken a sword out and chopped off an ear. To his willingness, as he hung on the cross, to say something like, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus manifested faith and endurance and grace in the face of gross injustice. To which, do you remember what happened? The Gentile, overseeing his crucifixion, responded with, truly, this man was the Son of God? Again, I know I'm showing you exceptions. I am showing you cases in which if we'll just go through the trial by fire, if we will go through it and suffer, that there will be those who will glorify God. But I'm not trying to paint some sort of rosy picture that the whole world will change because you suffer. No more than the whole world changed because Jesus suffered. But because Jesus suffered, some came to the truth, to the knowledge of the gospel. That was different. Jesus' crucifixion was different. And it is to that that we are called. And we read 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 20 previously, but we'll close with this. We'll close the series with this. Because this is our calling, brethren. What credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer for it, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. That would be different. That would be a different. And that's what we're all called to do, to follow in his steps, no matter the cost. And some will glorify God as a result of it. Are you ready to do that? Maybe the tougher question is, have you been doing that? The first place to start is in your home, by letting Christ rule in your home. The next place, let Christ rule in this church, amongst yourselves, and your interactions with one another. Being willing to suffer, to be different in a different way, different in the world, and then maybe we can make a difference in our families, in our churches, and in our communities. But if you're not yet a Christian, you can't make that difference. Or if you're a Christian who hasn't been being different, you can't make that difference. If you want to change that and make things right with your God, let us know. All together we stand and sing.